I think I first met our next speaker, Professor Sandra Harding, when she was the Dean of the faculty, the business faculty at QUT, and it was about 14 years ago. And I thought then that she was a somewhat dynamic figure, but I didn't realise how dynamic. Just to give you an idea of what her current roles include, she's a member of the Australian Research Council Advisory Council. She's been a commissioner on the Queensland Independent Commission of Audit, director of Regional Australia Institute, board member Skills Queensland, a council member of the Australian Institute of Marine Science. This is the important one, a director of the North Queensland Cowboys, a member of the Deputy Science and Technology Organisation Advisory Board and Deputy Chair, or I think it was Chair, of Universities Australia at a very critical time in tertiary education. And of course, Sandra, as the co-host of this conference, is the Vice-Chancellor and President of James Cook University, a post she took up, I think, in 2007, and has been very much the driving force behind the State of the Tropics report and this conference, and I'll ask her up to speak with you briefly and to formally thank the Minister. Sandra.
Thank you, Kerry. I appreciate that. And Kerry and I haven't changed a bit in 14 years, not at all when we've shared a stage before. If I can, most warmly thank the Treasurer, who I think must have had to head off immediately. I believe he may be coming back. But those were very fine words and very appropriate words as the opening keynote for our conference over today and tomorrow. So I want to just thank him very much for that, and I will have the chance to do that, I'm sure, later on. Now, my job is to provide a little bit of more information for you. I've got a presentation, I think, coming up. How do I get onto that? Scroll down. Excellent, there you are. So my brief today, in addition to thanking the Treasurer, which I will look forward to doing so very shortly, was to just give you a bit of more information about the State of the Tropics report. Now, you've heard quite a lot, and indeed the Treasurer was very well briefed, and Bob Manning too has been a part of this tropical journey for a while. But I just thought it would be well worthwhile just in the few minutes that I have to share a little bit of information to position the importance of this for you, and to understand that this isn't some sort of marketing pitch, this isn't a tagline, this isn't someone's flight of fancy about whether or not the tropics might be important in the world. This is objective data which is authentic and powerful, which tells us that there is a new global dynamic, and it's a global dynamic to which we must respond, and for which, in terms of that response, we must deal with some significant challenges, but we must also be alive to the significant opportunities. As Kerry said, and as Bob said too, it hasn't been the case necessarily that we've viewed the world in this lateral way, and it is an Aristotelian way of viewing the world. It was Aristotle who first wrote more than 2,000 years ago that there were three zones of the world: the frigid zone, the temperate zone, and Bob's torrid zone. But what Aristotle said was that the only place where civilised human beings could live was in the temperate zone. But here are we today, sitting in the torrid zone, along with more than 40% of the world's population, as you've heard, more than 80% of the world's biodiversity, and some of the most critical issues of our time. It's important that we understand, and I said at the reception last night, that Australia, Northern Australia, lies at the intersection of the two great axes of global growth: the Asian axis, which everyone's seeing, but also the tropical axis. And it's that tropical axis that our State of the Tropics report was designed to chart and to explore and to better understand, to see whether or not it was actually true that this is something that we should be taking seriously. And I'm pleased to be able to report to you, and this is the hard copy of the report, and indeed in all of your show bags, all of your sample bags, you have a thumb drive with a copy of the report on it. And what that report shows us is this is indeed an issue that we need to take seriously. Aung San Suu Kyi did indeed launch the report on the 29th of June this year in Burma. We had our own satellite uplink to an expert panel in Singapore. It all went well. Our distinguished Professor Bill Lawrence was on that panel, and we had events here in Cairns and Townsville as well. And I've got to tell you, it was an absolute privilege. It was awesome to share the stage with Aung San Suu Kyi and have her say how important it was for politicians to gain the benefit of academics and research and policy knowledge knowledge that could be produced in a report like this, because, as she said, politicians need to know this and policymakers need to know this in order that we can better understand and better respond to, as she put, the need for a more caring world. So that was the report she launched that day, and the sort of enlivening question was, is life in the tropics getting better? That's what we tried to set out to determine, is life in the tropics getting better? And the report was constructed, it was for 4 years since conception, 3 years in the work, and I'll tell you a little bit more about the project right now. As you can see there, the tropics, just to give a sense of the size and scope of this, if you didn't sort of mark that, have a look when you go outside at the big map on the wall, which was one that we produced for that launch. It's 109 nations compared to the rest of the world, which is 107 nations. The report divides the tropics up into 8 regions, and as I think somebody said, I can't remember who said, Oceania is the only region that's going backwards. And that's our near neighbour region. And that's a serious problem. And the Pacific Leaders Forum need to get onto this, and they are getting onto this, I'm pleased to be able to report. There are 8 straddling nations, including Australia, and we split out their tropical parts as well as the non-tropical part. We looked at 50 indicators to come to a view about whether life in the tropics was getting better. The data sources were valid and reliable data. More importantly, there's some softness in some of the data, but these are the data that policymakers use in order to make their decisions. And if there are problems with these data, we need to fix the data. But we use the best available data at the time. The analysis, as you can see, there is descriptive, high-level, longer term. There are partners. This report was initiated by James Cook University. It was, in my view, so important that it couldn't be just a JCU product or a Queensland product or an Australian product. So I went to 11 of my equivalent around the world with a concept paper co-written by Dennis Trewin, the former Australian statistician. And I said to people around the world, do you think this is important? And if so, would you be part of a leadership group? They came together, determined the parameters of the report, and 3 years later we had the report. The 12 institutions, just to let you know, are the Liverpool School of Tropical Medicine, which is the oldest school of tropical medicine in the world. Most of their field stations are in Africa. University of Nairobi. We had Mahidol University, which is an elite tropical health and medicine university in Thailand, the National University of Singapore, Nanyang Technological University in Singapore, of course us, University of Papua New Guinea, University of the South Pacific, University of Hawaii, Manoa, an Ecuadorian politics and economics university, the Organisation for Tropical Studies based in their field stations in Costa Rica, but their secretariat is at Duke University in North Carolina, and INPA, which is the Brazilian government's National Institute for Research on the Amazon. So it was the presidents, CEOs, vice-chancellors of all of those organisations that oversaw the production of this report. And I'm just going to run through just a few slides in the few minutes that I have remaining. You've seen some of these and heard some of these stats already, just so you can understand, and I'm going to come back to emphasise something at the end. So just run you through them. You can see those demographics right there. We've got to think about the environment as well, and the report is divided into the human system and the ecosystem. So 80% of the world's biodiversity or thereabouts. By 2050, and I want you just to think about this, and I'll remind you of it in the closing stages of my remarks, more than 50% of the world's population, in fact that's probably going to be into the 2030s, but by 2050 we're going to have a full 2/3 of the world's children will live in the tropics. 67%. The weight of the world's population will be living in the tropics. GDP growth is 20% faster than the rest of the world. Things are happening in the tropics. And indeed, the Galbraith quote that Bob provided for us earlier about how, everything's happening in the temperate zone. Warren McKibben, who is a professor at ANU, who used to be on the board of the Reserve Bank, I was talking to Warren recently and he's fascinated by the report because he says he's a macroeconomist, and what he says is that everyone knows that the further away from the equator you get, the lower the rates of economic development. This has been flipped. This is flipped now. So this is drawn from Galbraith and from traditional ways of viewing the world. In fact, the future belongs to the tropics and the energy is in the tropics. The tropical communities with those large populations are going to have a significant demographic dividend, which I'm sure Graham Hugo will tell us more about. And that's an important opportunity for us, but you've got to understand this is from a low base. The average at the moment is about 6 years of education, schooling. 51% of the world's children, on average, receive 6 years of schooling. It's not satisfactory, and it's certainly not going to be satisfactory for 2/3 of the world's children. Most people approaching most people are living in the cities, and we're expecting urbanisation to increase. And as that population grows, we've got to think about what that type of development will be. Mobile phone access is very important, and again, there are real commercial opportunities there, and not just commercial opportunities, but health services delivery, all sorts of opportunities as a result of that. Corruption is a significant issue for the tropical nations. We know that, and we know that the rule of law, there's an inverse relationship between the rule of law and economic development. Agricultural land area has only increased by a small proportion, as you can see there, since 1980, but production has increased by more than 50%. We need more of the sort of work that the Treasurer was talking about. Marine catch, and there are upsides and downsides to this quite clearly. We'll hear from Ian Poynter in a little while. He might comment on this. 41%, and it's growing out of the tropics. And aquaculture production, and I will remind the Treasurer of this later on. So 36% of global aquaculture production is occurring, and just recently, aquaculture, animal protein from aquaculture has surpassed beef as a source of animal protein in the world right now. And aquaculture is going to be increasingly important, and we need to be part of that, and I'm proud to be able to report to you that JCU has the strongest team on aquaculture in Australia and one of the strongest in the world working on this. So consider this. Consider 67% of the world's children living in the tropics by 2050. Think about the improvements, and the answer to the question, is life in the tropics getting better? The answer is yes, highly variable, and there are some challenges remain, but there are rising incomes, there are rising education levels, lower poverty rates, and there are opportunities here for sustainable development as we need to see realised. But we must consider the alternative. If what we don't do, I believe, as the rest of the world, and certainly the developed economies of the world, don't pay attention to the understanding of the enormous growth that's going to happen in the tropics in the near future, we see it coming, it is going to happen, we mustn't be surprised if there is going to be additional extremism and radicalism born out of grinding poverty, alienation and disadvantage. We've just got to understand that we're on the cusp here of another set of issues. And particularly if you imagine urbanisation, we can have the favelas of Brazil, or we can think about a more planned approach to this. We need economic infrastructure, health infrastructure, educational infrastructure into the tropics. We need better service delivery in order that we can indeed advance the world overall. So we know there is now a new global dynamic, and it's calling us to leadership. I'll just let you run your eyes down there because Kerry's looking at his watch. Australian leadership is important. We know about Northern Queensland and we know about Northern Australia and the focus on that at the moment. But this is just, like the State of the Tropics report, way too important to be an Australian issue and agenda. It is a G20 issue and agenda. It is very important in the world, and we must respond to it. I think we have a moral obligation in order to do just that. So thank you very much, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sandra.